The whole town of Havens Hollow agreed Alara was mad. They said it over the fence posts and across the counter at Gable's Mercantile. They said it as she knelt in the perpetual damp of the 2 acres her father had left her, a patch of ground so sour and waterlogged it was known only as the sump. But it wasn't her wrestling with the land that sealed their judgment. It was the geese. It was the sound that now drifted up from the sump at dawn and dusk, a chaotic chorus of honks and hisses from what the town had christened Alara's limper flock. She had knelt that morning in the mist with her hands buried in the cool, dark earth of a new garden bed, and she heard the whispers carry on the wind as clearly as if they stood beside her. Mad as a mud hen, wasting good money on broken birds. She had simply smiled, a small, secret thing, and patted the soil around the base of a cabbage that was already the size of a prize-winning pumpkin. The secret was still safe, banked low like a coal under ash, but it was getting harder to hide the glow. 6 months earlier, the madness had been given a name and a number. The name was Alara, newly returned to the hollow after her father's passing, a quiet woman of 26 with steady hands and eyes that saw more than they let on. The number was 95. That was the number of Goslings a traveling breeder had left her with, crammed into 3 large wooden crates in the back of her wagon. He had been passing through on his way to the river markets, his wagon heavy with prime stock, when a lurch in a deep rut had sent one of his breeding pens tumbling. The result was a cascade of broken legs and twisted wings. Not dead, but certainly not saleable. Not to anyone with sense. He'd stopped at Gable's for supplies, loudly lamenting his loss. Might as well feed them to the crows, he'd grumbled, loud enough for the whole store to hear. Lame birds are dead birds that just take longer to die. That was when Alara, there to spend her meager inheritance on seed and salt, had spoken up. Her voice was low and even. What would you take for the lot? The store went silent. The breeder turned, a thick-necked man with a shrewd glint in his eye, and saw a lone woman in a worn but clean dress. He saw the sorrow in her posture that still clung to her from her father's funeral a month prior. He saw an opportunity. For the cripples? He stroked his chin. A young woman alone, you'd have no use for such trouble. They'll need endless minding. I asked your price, Alara said again, her gaze unwavering. A snicker came from the corner where 2 farmers, the Hemlock brothers, were leaning on a barrel. Going to start a hospital for geese, Alara? One of them called out. Mr. Gable, polishing a brass scale on the counter, allowed himself a thin, condescending smile. Now, boys, Miss Alara has her reasons, I'm sure. Though what they might be, heaven only knows. The breeder, sensing the town's amusement as a bargaining chip, named a price that was an insult. It was still more than the birds were worth, but far less than healthy stock. He expected her to haggle, to shrink away. Instead, Alara counted out the coins onto the worn wooden counter. The clink of each one was a punctuation mark in the heavy silence. It was a significant portion of the money her father had left her. It was the sound of foolishness, the whole town agreed. She was buying 95 problems, 95 mouths that would eat and never earn. She signed the receipt, took the bill of sale, and walked out without another word, leaving the men in a cloud of smug pity. She hitched her old mare to the wagon and drove the cacophonous, crippled cargo down the lane to the sump, the laughter of the town following her like a bad smell. She did not look back. She was counting, not the money she'd spent, but the legs that still worked. She was doing the arithmetic of survival, and in her quiet, stubborn mind, the numbers were already beginning to add up. The first week was a misery of mud and frantic energy. The sump, true to its name, was less a field and more a sponge. Water oozed up from the ground with every step, and the air was thick with the hum of mosquitoes. It was a phrase she heard in her dreams, a verdict passed down from on high. But Alara did not see one woman alone. She saw a pair of hands, a strong back, and a mind that worked best when others had given up. She'd spent the first 2 days not on the geese, but on the water. With a shovel her father had worn smooth with his own labor, she began to dig. She wasn't fighting the water, she was guiding it. She dug a series of deep, narrow trenches, mapping the land's lowest points, using a carpenter's level and a long string to find the subtle grades. The work was brutal. Her hands, softened by years away, blistered on the first day and bled on the second. By the third, they were beginning to form the calluses she remembered from her childhood. She worked from the first hint of gray light until the bats began to swoop in the twilight, her world shrinking to the blade of the shovel, the suck of the mud, and the ache in her shoulders. The Hemlock brothers rode by on their way to town and hollered down. "Trying to dig to China, Alara?" She just wiped the sweat from her brow with a muddy forearm and kept digging. While she worked, she pinned the Goslings in a makeshift enclosure near the cottage. They were a pathetic sight, a hobbling, hissing mass of downy fluff and misplaced fury. Many had splinted legs she'd fashioned from kindling and strips of cloth. Others simply dragged a useless wing. They could not roam. They could not fly. They could not run from a predator. This, she knew, was their great weakness. It was also, she wagered, their greatest strength. They were a captive army. By the end of the first week, the trenches began to do their work. They bled the surrounding soil, drawing the standing water into channels that all fed into the lowest corner of the property, where a small, stagnant pond began to grow into a larger, clearer one. The ground firmed up. For the first time in years, the air in the sump didn't feel like breathing soup. Then she brought in the geese. She sectioned off the newly drained land into a series of large paddocks with low wattle fencing she wove from willow branches. Each day, she would move the entire limping, complaining flock into a new paddock. They grumbled, but they moved. And then, they did what geese do. They ate. They ate everything. They ate the sour grasses, the bitter weeds, the strange, rubbery fungi that grew in the damp. Their beaks were relentless, stripping the paddock bare down to the wet black soil. And behind them, they left a fortune, a constant, nitrogen-rich rain of manure that dotted the stripped earth. After they had moved on, Alara would follow with a rake and a bucket of her own compost, turning the droppings into the soil. She was not just draining the land, she was feeding it. The geese were not her pets. They were her partners. They were her plow, her weeder, and her fertilizer, all in one noisy, gimpy package. Her only regular visitor was Mr. Anders, an old Norwegian farmer whose land bordered hers on the high, dry side. He was a man of few words, with a face creased like a topographical map of his homeland. He didn't mock. He watched. He came down one afternoon, his hands clasped behind his back, and stood at the edge of the paddock where the geese were gorging themselves. He watched Alara mend a fence, her movements efficient and sure. "The town says you are a fool," he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. Alara drove a fence post into the soft earth. "The town thinks land is only for plows and cows," she replied without looking up. "This land is for water and wings." Mr. Anders nodded slowly, a deep, knowing sound in his chest. He gestured with his chin toward the bare patch the geese had just vacated, dark and rich and dotted with white. "My father used to say, the hungry earth always tells you what it needs. You only have to listen." He looked at her then, his pale blue eyes clear and direct. "You are a good listener, Miss Alara." It was the first kind word she'd heard in a month. It was enough. By June, a rhythm had settled over the sump. The sun rose, Alara rose, and the geese began their clamor for breakfast. A young boy from the village, Finn, started appearing at her fence line. He was a thin, shy boy of about 10, the kind who was always on the periphery of the other children's games, more comfortable with stray cats and creek minnows than with people. He never spoke, just watched. He watched her move the flock, his eyes wide with fascination at the organized chaos. He watched her work in the gardens she had planted in the geese's wake. One morning, she looked up from weeding a row of beans and saw him standing there, holding a small, wriggling garter snake by the tail. He held it out to her. "His name is Silas," the boy whispered, as if it were a great secret. Alara smiled. "That's a fine name. Does he help you work?" Finn shook his head, then reconsidered. "He eats the bugs. A useful fellow, then," Alara said. "I have 95 useful fellows myself, but they don't have names." From that day on, Finn became a fixture. He was quiet, but his hands were quick. He learned to mix the geese's supplemental feed, to check the splints on the birds that still needed them, and to help move the wattle fences. His favorite job, however, was the naming. He took it very seriously. There was Hector, a big, bossy gander who walked with a pronounced swagger. There was Pip, a small goose who had a permanently crooked neck but the loudest honk. There was Old Man Hemlock and his brother, 2 geese who were always bickering in the corner of the paddock. Finn named them all, and Alara, to his delight, used the names. It transformed the flock from an anonymous mass into a community of individuals. It also, she noticed, made the geese seem less like livestock and more like residents. The gentle irony was not lost on her. The town saw a flock of cripples. Finn saw 95 heroes with names like Sir Reginald and Barnaby and Gustav. The land itself was changing. The sour smell was gone, replaced by the scent of damp, living earth and clover. In the plots the geese had cleared and fertilized months ago, things were growing with an almost alarming vigor. The cabbages were dense and heavy, the lettuces crisp and shockingly green. The soil, once a sticky gray clay, was now dark, friable, and crawling with earthworms. She had done the arithmetic. The cost of the geese, the cost of the seed, her own labor. She kept a ledger, and the numbers were tipping. But the true profit was not in the ledger. It was in the silence. The slugs and snails that plagued every other garden in the damp valley of Haven's Hollow were entirely absent from hers. The geese, in their relentless foraging, had devoured not just the weeds, but every slug, every snail, every egg. Her gardens were pristine islands of edibility. She knew this was her secret weapon, the ace up her sleeve. She continued to buy her staples from Gables, enduring the smirks and the pitying looks. She never brought her own produce to town. Not yet. It was not time. The secret was still a coal, warming her hands in the cold company of the town's disapproval. She could wait. Patience, she was learning, was a form of power. August arrived like the open door of a furnace, then slammed shut with a month of cold, unceasing rain. For the farmers in the valley, it was a familiar misery. But this year was different. The damp warmth of late spring had been a perfect incubator, and now the valley was crawling. It began as a rumor, a complaint about nibbled leaves. Then it became a tide. Slugs. Not the usual garden pests, but a glistening, silent army that swarmed out of the damp woods and waterlogged fields each night. They were everywhere. They slimed their way across thresholds, coated stone walls, and, most devastatingly, they devoured the crops. The fields of the Hemlock brothers, planted thick with cabbages and beans, were turned to lacework overnight. Farmer McGregor's prized pumpkins, swelling for the county fair, were hollowed out into rotting, slimy gourds. The town's collective kitchen gardens, a point of pride and a source of winter sustenance, were annihilated. A sense of grim panic began to set in. Gables Mercantile did a brisk business in salt and ash and beer traps, but it was like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. The slugs were a plague. Through it all, Alara's 2 acres remained an island. A green, lush, untouched paradise. People on the high road would stop their wagons and just stare. They would look from their own tattered fields to her perfect rows, and the mockery that had once colored their tone curdled into a new, sharper emotion, envy. Whispers started again. She was a witch, some said. She'd made a pact. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. Her first real test came in the form of a river barge cook, a man named Silas, ironically enough, who had a face like a disgruntled potato. His barge had put in for repairs, and he'd come to town seeking fresh produce, only to be met with tales of woe and ruin. Gable, ever the opportunist, directed him down to the sump with a wink and a nudge. "Go see the goose girl," he'd said, loud enough for half the town to hear. "Maybe she's got some magic beans to sell." The cook arrived at her gate, his skepticism a palpable force. "Heard you might have greens," he grunted, eyeing the flock of loudly honking, limping geese with profound disdain. Untouched by the slime, Alara didn't speak. She walked to the nearest cabbage, a specimen so large and perfect it looked like something from a fairy tale. With a small knife, she sliced off a wedge of the outer leaf and held it out to him. The cook took it, his expression unchanging. He sniffed it. He held it to the light. Then, reluctantly, he took a bite. The silence that followed was profound. The loud crunch echoed in the damp air. The man's eyes widened. He chewed slowly, then again, his whole demeanor changing. It was the taste of pure, vital green. The taste of sunshine and clean earth, without a hint of the bitter slime that had tainted everything else in the valley. "How much?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "How much for everything you can spare?" Alara named a price. It was a fair price, not a gouging one. He didn't even haggle. He and his deckhand spent the next 2 hours loading crates of cabbages, bundles of kale, and sacks of perfect, unblemished potatoes onto a handcart. As they were leaving, the cook paused and looked back, not at Alara, but at the geese. Hector was holding cord in the middle of the paddock, while Pip let out a series of triumphant, neck-craning honks. "Funny," the cook said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I never figured a goose for a gardener." Alara just smiled. The coal under the ash had just been fanned by a strong, fresh breeze. It was beginning to glow for all to see. The story of the barge cook and his cart full of perfect vegetables spread through Haven's Hollow faster than the slug plague itself. The town's mockery, which had already soured to envy, now fermented into a bewildered, grudging respect. People who used to cross the street to avoid her now found excuses to walk the high road past the sump, hoping to catch a glimpse of the impossible green. They saw Alara and young Finn moving among the rows, harvesting basket after basket of produce while their own fields withered. And they saw the geese, the ridiculous, crippled flock, waddling contentedly in their paddocks, the unlikely guardians of this Eden. The first to break was Martha Hemlock, wife of the younger Hemlock brother. Her husband was a proud, frightened man, his bluster stripped away along with his crops. He was facing ruin. Martha came to Alara's gate one evening at dusk, her face pale and drawn. She carried an empty basket. She did not bring money. "Alara," she began, her voice cracking. "My children, they haven't had a fresh green in a month. The salt pork is nearly gone." She couldn't meet Alara's eyes. This was the wife of one of the men who had laughed the loudest. I know what people said, but I'm asking you now. Is there anything you can spare?" Alara looked at the woman's worn face, the desperation in her eyes. She saw not the wife of a scoffer, but a mother. She thought of the arithmetic of survival, and how quickly it could turn against anyone. She went into her cottage and came back not with a few vegetables, but with a full sack. Potatoes, a head of cabbage, a thick bunch of kale, and a half-dozen enormous goose eggs, their shells the color of ivory. "The eggs are good for baking," Alara said softly. "They're very rich." Martha burst into tears. She tried to offer the empty basket as some kind of trade, but Alara gently pushed it back. "Feed your family, Martha," she said. "That's all." This act of generosity was a louder statement than any words of triumph could have been. The story of the full sack, given freely, was a seismic event in the town's social landscape. It shamed the proud and gave hope to the desperate. One by one, others came, not with demands, but with quiet, humble requests. A family with a sick grandmother. A young couple with a new baby. Each time, Alara was generous. She didn't keep a running tab of who had mocked her and who had been kind. She simply saw the hunger and met it. She was not just a good farmer. She was a good neighbor. And in doing so, she was binding the town to her, not with debt, but with gratitude. This, of course, could not stand. Mr. Gable saw it all from his perch at the mercantile. He saw the respect shifting. He saw a new economy emerging in the valley, one that didn't run through his store or his ledgers. He had once tried to buy the sump from her for pennies on the dollar, calling it a favor. Now, that sour patch of mud was the most valuable land in the county, and he didn't own it. His own vast, neat fields were a wasteland of slime. His greed, dressed in a suit of false concern, finally came calling. He arrived in a polished buggy, a stark contrast to the muddy lane. He didn't get out. He called for her from his seat, as if summoning a servant. "Miss Alara, a word, if you please." Alara came to the gate, wiping her hands on her apron. Finn stood behind her, slightly hidden, clutching a small wooden goose he had carved. "A remarkable turnaround," Gable began, his tone dripping with a smooth, false warmth. "Truly remarkable. The whole town is talking. A testament to diligence." He couldn't bring himself to mention the geese. "I've come with a proposition. A business opportunity. This slug problem is a crisis. A crisis for the whole community." "I'm aware," Alara said. "Of course. But what you may not be aware of is the potential. Your flock, your unique methods, have value." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I want to buy your geese. I'll give you a price that will make you the wealthiest woman in this county. You could move away from this damp place. Start fresh somewhere new." Alara's expression didn't change. They're not for sale. Gable's smile tightened. Don't be sentimental. They're birds. I'm offering you a fortune. I have a fortune, Alara said, gesturing to the green fields behind her. They are not for sale, Mr. Gable. His face darkened. The false warmth evaporated, revealing the cold certainty beneath. Then perhaps we can come to another arrangement. Elise, you will bring your flock to my fields. I will pay you a fee, of course. A very generous fee. It was not a request. It was a command wrapped in the language of commerce. He believed, as he always had, that everything and everyone had a price he could afford to pay. He had miscalculated. He did not understand the arithmetic of dignity. Alara looked at Mr. Gable, his fine suit and his polished buggy, and his face contorted with a mixture of greed and impatience. She thought of Martha Hemlock's tears and Finn's quiet loyalty. She thought of Mr. Anders' simple wisdom. The hungry earth always tells you what it needs. The earth needed tending. But a town, she was realizing, was like the earth. It, too, could grow sick and sour. It, too, could be starved. And it, too, told you what it needed, if you were willing to listen. No, Mr. Gable, she said, her voice as calm and steady as a river. His face flushed with anger. No, a young woman alone cannot possibly manage this kind of asset. You are being foolish. I am trying to help you. I am trying to help this town. Are you? Alara asked. Her gaze was level. Or are you trying to help your own ledgers? Your fields are ruined. The Hemlock's fields are ruined. McGregor's fields are ruined. The town is facing a winter of hunger. You want to rent my flock to save your own crop, and then sell that same grain back to the people at an inflated price when they are desperate. That is your arithmetic, Mr. Gable. It is not mine. Gable was stunned into silence. It was as if she had read the private, ugly numbers in his head. He sputtered, How did you know my plan? Alara didn't answer. She didn't need to. The slip had been made. The man had revealed himself. His smooth, false warmth had cracked, showing the cold machine of profit beneath. The question hung in the air between them, an admission of guilt. My flock will not be saving one man's fortune while the rest of the town starves, she continued. They are not for hire. With a strangled curse, Gable snapped the reins and his horse lunged forward, the buggy wheels spinning in the mud. He left in a spray of dirt and fury, defeated not by a show of force, but by a quiet, unshakable refusal to play his game. As the sound of his buggy faded, Finn looked up at her, his eyes shining. You told him, he whispered, full of awe. Alara looked down at the boy, then out at the green fields, and finally at the noisy, waddling, beloved flock. No, she said, a real smile finally reaching her eyes. We told him the time for secrets was over. It was time for a new kind of arithmetic, the arithmetic of community. That evening, she sent Finn around the valley with a message. Not to Gable, but to the Hemlocks, to McGregor, to Martha, and to all the others. She asked them to meet at her farm at dawn. She had a proposition of her own. They came. At first light, a small, somber crowd of farmers gathered at Alara's gate. They were men and women she had known her whole life, but only as background figures, members of the chorus that had judged her. Now they stood before her, their pride worn thin by desperation, their faces etched with worry. They looked at her perfect fields, then at their own ruined ones, and waited. Mr. Gable was conspicuously absent. Alara stood on her porch, Finn at her side. She didn't look down on them. She looked at them. I know your fields are in trouble, she began, her voice carrying in the still morning air. The slugs have taken almost everything. A murmur of grim agreement went through the crowd. John Hemlock, his face haggard, spoke for them. They've taken it all, Alara. We're ruined. No, she said firmly. You are not. Not yet. She took a deep breath. Mr. Gable offered to buy my flock yesterday, for a great deal of money. He wanted to use them to save his own crop. A wave of anger and resentment rippled through the farmers. Of course he had. That was Gable's way. I refused him, Alara said. The crowd grew still. I told him my flock was not for hire. She let that sink in. They are not for hire today, either. But they are for helping. She laid out her plan. It was simple, elegant, and entirely unexpected. She would not rent them out to the highest bidder. She would create a cooperative. Starting with the field nearest her own, she and Finn would bring the flock, contained within their portable wattle fences, onto a section of a neighbor's land. The limper flock would do what they did best. They would eat. They would clear the slugs, every last one. Then they would move to the next section and the next until the field was clean. From there, they would move to the next farm and the one after that. They will save what's left of your harvest, she explained. They will eat the pests and fertilize the soil for next year's planting. The farmers stared at her, dumbfounded. It was a lifeline so incredible they could hardly grasp it. What's the price? McGregor asked, his voice thick with suspicion. Nothing was free. The price is this, Alara said, her gaze sweeping over their faces.